Thank you so much, Dr. Sanjay Singh. That was such a terrific introduction. I think former President Johnson, when introduced like this, used to say, that's a kind of introduction that my father would have been proud of, but only my mother would have believed. So thank you for welcoming me so warmly. And I'm delighted to be with you all today in the city of Omaha, though I must admit, all I've seen of it is under a drizzly, cloudy, gray canopy, which I hear he's going to remove by the afternoon. But maybe the weather was designed to keep us indoors at this Indo-US Friendship Summit. Delighted also to accept the invitation of the Indian Association of Nebraska and the Asian World Center at Creighton University. I myself am a product of two Jesuit schools, so it's a particular pleasure to be behind this platform at Creighton. And also, as we've heard a great deal about the way in which the Indian Association has been doing so much to try and encourage awareness and consciousness of the mutuality of good relations between our two countries. It's wonderful to be part of all of this. Given the volatility that both our countries have faced since about November of last year, the question of our relationship and its future is certainly an important one to ponder. And indeed, it's left many of our seasoned observers, I think, on both sides, somewhat perplexed. In fact, yesterday, hearing television debates about the calm before the storm, I think was the latest, the latest unusual statement, shall we say, emerging from on high. It appears now, at least for now, that the only thing we can be certain of is how uncertain things seem to be in the Trump era. But since I'm speaking to busy people, some of whom, of course, are geopolitical analysts of the highest pedigree, and we've been privileged to listen to Professor Morrison just now, and your patience is naturally limited and might want to know exactly what you can take away from listening to me, I thought I should make it worthwhile for you by giving you a few points about this important relationship, a few takeaways about this Indo-US relationship. And it reminded me as I was thinking about this, when Woodrow Wilson, a towering leader in his time, announced his famous 14 points to end the First World War. France's then president, Georges Clemenceau, remarked, 14 points? Even the good Lord, he only needed 10. So Moses, of course, had more time than we have today. And since Congressman Krishnamurthy has already set the bar by confining himself to 3 points, let me just advance 4 simple propositions about what the Indo-US relationship today represents and the challenges that both will have to address if we are to convert this relationship into a unique and nuanced, high-value partnership in the future. So the first point, to borrow an old advertising slogan of the generation of some of us in this room, we've come a long way, baby. The Indo-US relationship has evolved significantly over time. As you know, when we talk about this kind of relationship, the best crystal ball is always the rear-view mirror. And as I've stressed in recent months in a different context, in my book about British colonialism in India, I keep telling young people, if you don't know where you've come from, how will you appreciate where you're going? So on the same principle, we should look back a little bit, because in the first decades of India's independence, its relations with the US were far from close. This should have been surprising because the two countries had a lot in common then too, as they do today. Both are vibrant democracies that believe in human rights, the free press, fundamental freedoms, and more. Both had experienced colonialism, though at different times, and broken new ideological and political ground thereafter as independent countries. As Henry Kissinger noted, the two countries have no, and I'm quoting here, no conflict of interest in the traditional and fundamental sense, unquote. Mutual trade and investment have been growing steadily, and people-to-people relations, strengthened by a common language, by 150,000 students a year, spending $5 billion, as we've been reminded, on educational and related services, and by more than 4 million people of Indian origin who have made their lives in the US, All this has meant that our relations have been characterized by friendship and warmth. But in 1947, the Indian Americans were just a handful. There wasn't yet a Samosa caucus. And there were two major factors that didn't help the cause of Indo-US amity: US ignorance and Indian unwillingness to take sides in the Cold War. America's initial indifference was best reflected in President Harry Truman's reaction when Chester Bowles, to his surprise, asked to be named ambassador to India. And Truman said, "I thought India was pretty jammed with poor people and cows around the streets, witch doctors and people sitting on hot coals and bathing in the Ganges, but I didn't realize anybody thought it was important." Quote unquote, Truman's actual words. Now that was bad. India's political orientation was worse. The American preference for making anti-communist allies, however unsavory, tied Washington to Pakistan's increasingly Islamist military dictatorship, while India's non-aligned democracy drifted towards the secular Soviet embrace. The US government regarded non-alignment with distaste. Eisenhower's Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, notoriously declared that neutrality between good and evil is itself evil. In fact, there is a famous story, perhaps apocryphal, of Dulles in a phrase that we've all heard more recently on the lips of an American president, allegedly said to Nehru, "Are you with us or against us?" And Nehru replied, "Yes." So we're with you when we agree with you, we're against you when we disagree with you. Now, in a world divided between two uncompromising superpowers, India's refusal to ally with its fellow democracies seemed like appeasement at best and aid and comfort for the enemy at worst. India's arch enemy and perpetual irritant, Pakistan, on the other hand, became an essential component in America's strategy of containment of the Soviet Union and later of its opening to China. From India's point of view, the US indulgence of Pakistan became overt hostility when President Nixon sent the 7th Fleet into the Bay of Bengal in support of the Pakistani military genocide in Bangladesh in 1971. Tempers cooled soon enough, but India was always regarded as tilting toward the Kremlin, hardly a recommendation in American eyes. Matters plumbed their depths during these two historic lows, 1971 that I've mentioned, when the US and India found themselves on opposite sides over the Bangladesh crisis, and India signed a treaty with the Soviet Union. And then in 1998, when India tested its nuclear capabilities at Pokhran and the US imposed sanctions on it. But since then, we have seen a sea change. With China's rise, India's growing economically more vibrant, and an increasing convergence of Indian and US views of strategic priorities in the Indo-Pacific region. The Indo-US nuclear deal signed by Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and President George Bush in 2005 marked an astonishing breakthrough from the days of the sanctions, the nuclear sanctions of 98 to 2000. The 123 Agreement for Nuclear Cooperation essentially recognized India as a de facto nuclear state. I think Professor Morrison has pretty much said the same thing, and enshrined an Indian exception that opened up an entire new vista of security and defense possibilities. The narrative today can be seen as a remarkable success story. The record shows both how fast the strategic partnership has come, but also how much more can be done. The nuclear accord simultaneously accomplished two things. It admitted India into the global nuclear club, despite its principal refusal to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which Indians overwhelmingly reject as the last vestige of apartheid in the international system. I find it surprising that Americans don't see what an amoral and unethical piece of international law it is to have a treaty that says some countries are entitled to have something that other countries are not. That is simply unjustifiable under any yardstick, especially accompanied by the hypocrisy that the pledged intent to disarm has been honored in the breach ever since the treaty was signed. But the treaty apart, the US has admitted India de facto into the nuclear club, and more importantly, I think from India's point of view, it acknowledged that US exceptionalism had found a sibling. Thanks to the US, which strong-armed the 45 countries of the nuclear suppliers group into swallowing their concerns that special treatment for India could constitute a precedent for rogue nuclear aspirants such as Pakistan, North Korea, and Iran. And even though China has blocked the admission of India into the group, in practical terms, in terms of India's ability to get nuclear supplies, there is now an Indian exception. Few things could have been more gratifying to a deeply proud nation that was tired of being constantly hyphenated by Washington with its smaller, dysfunctional neighbor, Pakistan. Now, under Obama, of course, nothing quite so dramatic occurred as this breakthrough. First of all, the US's grand strategic orientation inevitably focused on the rise of China, which, as Secretary of State Hillary Clinton had indicated, but she openly said it, was Washington's most important bilateral relationship on the planet. And on the subcontinent, the Obama administration's understandable concerns in Afghanistan inevitably made Pakistan loom much larger in its consciousness than India. To Obama, it was clear there could be no successful outcome in Afghanistan possible without Pakistani cooperation, and therefore the US was attentive to Islamabad's priorities in ways that New Delhi found irritating. And it's fair to say that during Obama's Nobel Prize-winning first year in office, a skeptical India was largely immune to the wave of what one might irreverently call the Globamaization that swept the rest of the planet. But there was progress on other fronts, the small but significant steps that add up to strengthening the sinews of any relationship. Agreements on seemingly mundane subjects like agriculture, education, health, even space exploration and energy security testified to enhanced cooperation. And the two governments also proclaimed initiatives on clean energy and climate change, as well as on educational linkages between American and Indian universities. The problem is that the pattern down the decades has tended to be one where every few years, with much optimism, very positive declarations are made or hopes are loudly expressed that India-US relations have entered a new and positive era, only to be undone thereafter by one setback or another. In recent times, for example, much has been written about the relationship between the President of the US and the Prime Minister of India. We had the recent visit of Prime Minister Modi to the US in July this year, and then on the meeting with President Trump on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Hamburg. For that first interaction, the bar of expectations was certainly set quite low, primarily because there was considerable uncertainty in India regarding President Trump's personal convictions on foreign policy. For example, though he developed a fairly hardline rhetoric on the issue of US-China relations and appointed a number of known China bashers to key positions, we were all well aware of the well-publicized bonhomie that was on display when President Xi visited the Mar-a-Lago resort of President Trump, something that took everyone by surprise. This reaffirmed the growing belief that with President Trump, no assumptions can be taken for granted. Many Indian Americans had enthusiastically supported the Trump candidacy, believing his victory would be good for India. Now Indians weren't so sure. There was the episode of Trump singling out of India in his statement withdrawing from the Paris Accord, unfairly accusing India of not contributing adequately to the fight against climate change and of essentially being a freeloader on global energy policies. This was understandably seen in New Delhi as a setback for Indo-US relations. So the Indians approached the summit with a mixture of anxiety and low expectations. New Delhi was anxious to ensure that a personal rapport could be established between Modi and Trump, who till then had only interacted briefly over a congratulatory phone call. But they had no reason to expect any significant breakthrough. Though the visit didn't quite end up generating a bromance between the two, as seemed to have begun between India and the US, Modi's first name terms relationship with his friend Barack was obviously a tough act to follow. But the meeting went pretty well, featuring Modi's famous public hug of Trump, which seemed to take the president by surprise, but didn't seem to displease him. Still, the summit was low on actual substance, and once you examine the nuts and bolts of the joint statement that was published, Modi did say a lot of things that Trump wanted to hear, including a promise to spend more taxpayer money buying American, including purchasing 20 Guardian drones. An Indian investment in the US, based on data from the US Department of Commerce, creates something like 197,000 jobs in this country. And that, given the transactional nature of President Trump's calculations, should be something the US appreciates. On the Indian side, however, there's a feeling that India accomplished very little in return. The issue of H-1B visas, an area of significant concern for India with its ever-expanding IT sector, but a campaign target for President Trump, wasn't brought up. I'm delighted that Congressman Krishnamurthy is introducing a resolution that would lift that per-country cap, which disproportionately hurts Indians. Overall, while the joint statement highlighted several aspects of what India could offer to the US, particularly defense acquisitions and market access, there was little discussion, it seems, on what the US could offer India. But the way things went, given how they might have gone, brings me to my second point, and that is, whether it's Republicans or Democrats in America, or the Congress or the BJP in India, the fundamentals of the relationship between our two countries are sound and will survive political change in either country. The transformation of the India-US relationship from estrangement to strategic partnership is well advanced, and the relationship has clearly acquired a depth that goes beyond the utilitarian measurement of successful transactions, even if it faces the occasional setback. The strong foundations I just mentioned have been developed both by various governments over the past 2 decades, but very often also in spite of governments. Ideologically, India identifies with and has a close relationship with American democracy, liberal internationalism, and so far anyway, the cosmopolitanism emerging from widespread immigration. As I've observed frequently before for both countries, soft power is an integral component of what drives their role in the world, the power of attraction. For Harvard's Joseph Nye, my good old friend from many years back, who invented the concept, the US in many ways is the archetypal exponent of soft power. You're the home of Boeing and Intel, of Google and the iPad, of Microsoft and MTV, Hollywood and Disneyland, Coke and Levi's, McDonald's and Starbucks. In short, of most of the major products that dominate daily life around our globe. The attractiveness of these assets and of the American lifestyle of which they're emblematic is that they permit the US to persuade others to adopt the US's agenda through attraction rather than relying purely on the dissuasive or coercive hard power of military force. I mean, the old joke was that all these protesters outside US embassies around the world were shouting, "Yankee, go home, but take me with you." You know, so this was very much the attraction of the US. For India too, Bollywood and Bhangra and Bhelpuri have done more to enhance its presence in the world than the Ministry of External Affairs or the Indian Army. When you can... I'm glad that nobody from the Ministry of External Affairs made it here today. One of my favorite stories about them in the old days was recounted to me by an Indian diplomat who had already retired when he told me the story in the late 1970s. I was researching my PhD on Indian foreign policy making at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at the time. And I called on him and he said, "You know, my boy, Indian diplomacy is like the lovemaking of an elephant. It is conducted at a very high level, accompanied by much bellowing, and the results are not known for 2 years." Now, fortunately, Indian diplomacy has become much more sprightly and agile and reflective and positive and energetic since then. That's in case any of them have tuned in, you know, on the web. No, I mean, the fact is they do a good job, and there's a lot that happens despite or without official government involvement. You know, when you can find an Indian restaurant or a yoga class in any small town in America, you know that Indian soft power is working here. And when you reflect on the fact that an Indian invented the Pentium chip, an Indian created Hotmail, an Indian co-founded Sun Microsystems, and Indians basically involved in 40% of the startups in Silicon Valley in the last 20 years. You know that the word IIT has become as potent a brand name in certain circles in this country as MIT used to be. Of course, sometimes this has very unintended consequences. The image of Indians has changed so much that when a friend of mine, a history major like myself, happened to be transiting through Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam, he was accosted by an anxiously perspiring European saying, you're Indian, can you help me fix my laptop? The old days when I came here to graduate school in 1975, the image was of the image of Indians was, you know, snake charmers, naked fakirs lying on beds of nails, or at best Maharajas on caparisoned elephants. Today, the image is that every Indian must be a software geek, a computer guru, or a doctor, right? I mean, that's, in fact, since we are here at the invitation of a doctor, Dr. Sanjay Singh, let me tell him a story which I'm sure he must have been aware of because he was already in this country when it happened. I was in the UN in those days, in the beginning of the century. There was a hit television show called ER, Emergency Room. You seen it? Okay, so when the pilot was released, and it was, you know, the whole thing was conceived as a major blockbuster, it got panned by the critics for one simple reason. They said, it's unbelievable. Who's ever seen an emergency room in America without an Indian doctor? So they actually had to rewrite. They rewrote the series to write in a part for an Indian doctor, which was then played by Parminder Nagra of Bend It Like Beckham fame. And then it became a big hit and was a #1 show in the US for a few years. So that shows you how much Indians have arrived in this country. So the prominence of Indian Americans in American life and on your television screens, their vital role as fundraisers for US politicians, let's not minimize that. Their presence on congressional staffs and governmental office, all points to Indians playing an influential role in American public life. And we've just heard this brilliant speech by Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy, who's told us about the Samosa Caucus. We've had 2 Indian American governors and currently 6 congresspersons, right? A senator and your ambassador to the UN, all of Indian descent. They've shown a willingness to stand up and be heard on issues that matter to India, with one exception, and we won't name. I think everyone knows there was one Indian American governor and congressman who liked as far as possible to run away from his Indian identity, but the rest have certainly been willing to stand up and face up to it and to be heard. In any case, you know, we've also had one of non-Indian descent, Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, who's more Indian than many others. So we're not doing too badly, I think, on Capitol Hill. And I believe in the long term, Indian Americans will come to play the same role in relation to US policy on India as Jewish Americans play in relation to US policy on Israel, and for very similar reasons. But there are also harder factors at work than soft power. I know that woke you all up this morning, but that really is not enough. That's the feel-good stuff. But let's look in economic and transactional terms. It's a fact cooperation has been growing steadily stronger, despite occasional irritants. Take arms sales. In 2001 to 4, India purchased arms and defense supplies worth $400 million from the US. From 2005 to 8, this multiplied to $3.2 billion, with the purchases including the USS Trenton and 20 GE F404 engines for our indigenously made Tejas fighter, 6 Hercules aircraft, and 8 maritime control aircraft. Then between 2009 and 13, the defense purchases multiplied again to $5.7 billion. And that included sensor-fused weapons for Jaguar aircraft, Harpoon anti-ship missiles, Hercules again, Globemaster transport aircraft. In other words, the total value of defense purchases made by India between 2008 and 13 were 10 times the value of the deals signed in a similar 5-year period a decade earlier. So, however, what's interesting is that so far India has largely bought non-combat support equipment from the US and no lethal equipment. Still, the US has now overtaken Russia, India's defense supplier, in terms of the value of trade. Where do we go from here? India has admittedly a low defense technology base, which does not allow it perhaps to take advantage of all the options the US can offer. And while this is a good beginning, the challenge is to raise the bar and take our technological cooperation to the next level. So the fundamentals undergirding our relationship include our democratic systems, our mutual understanding, no significant areas of difference with the end of the Cold War, growing defense cooperation, comparable soft power assets, and a thriving Indo-American community. There's also an increasing convergence of geopolitical views, particularly on China's rise and the threat it poses to East Asia, and of course including to India, and Professor Morrison laid that out very clearly. But before I get carried away, let me mention my third point. For all these areas of convergence, there have been almost equally strong areas of divergence in the relationship. And how our two countries manage to navigate these differences will prove crucial to developing an enhanced strategic partnership. It's in the natures of democracies to disagree, including with each other. I've just been talking about defense cooperation, for instance, but let's face it, constraints exist on both sides of the fence. Indian defense procurement procedures, which are being revised, still don't go down very well with US suppliers, while US licensing constraints don't agree with India's interests. For instance, the government of India's latest Make in India campaign that the congressman mentioned is reinforcing our traditional preference for, if not entirely developing weaponry at home, at least co-manufacturing it with foreign investors, instead of making full purchases from abroad. There are structural differences on the American side with such a Make in India approach, because the US has long-standing export control requirements that make any transfer of technology in such fields conditional on direct and close scrutiny of end-use monitoring, to which India cannot fully agree, besides requiring an assortment of bureaucratic sanctions. Both countries ultimately need to make an effort to find a compromise that is mutually agreeable. In fact, it was to facilitate this that in 2012, the government of India, the government of which I was then a part, set up the Defense Technology and Trade Initiative, under which so far India and the US have agreed to start cooperation on various Pathfinder projects. But given that by the beginning of the year, progress had only been made on 2 of those projects, it's clear that the kind of big, momentous developments we all want are yet to occur. It has helped that the government of India has now decided to increase foreign direct investment in defense to 49%, making its traditional formula somewhat more palatable to the US, but many US companies would not settle for anything less than full control, and 49% falls short of that. In general, the Indian preference to domesticate high technology, including in defense, goes against the American tendency to embed India into its global defense supply chain. While increased FDI will soften this impasse somewhat, legislation on this alone will not satisfy the US, which also wants clarity on labor laws, control of management, and on intellectual property rights. So it's too early to get our hopes too high. Beyond defense procurement, trade between the two countries has also seen progress, but not enough, and not close to optimal levels. Data from the Department of Commerce, for example, the US Department of Commerce, suggests that the bilateral trade relationship between the US and South Korea, a country whose GDP is just about 40% of India's, enjoys a volume of trade nearly twice the size of India's current trade with the US. The US-China trade is, of course, 6 times the Indian figure. India is currently only the 9th largest goods trading partner of the US at $67.7 billion in global trade as of last year. The deficit in trade stands at $24.3 billion in favor of India, which of course President Trump keeps referring to, and that doesn't help either. In terms of services, trade between the two countries stood at $47.2 billion with a deficit of $6.5 billion, again in India's favor. But the US ought to be big enough not to let that be the kind of irritant that frequent references from the president suggest it's become. Similarly, FDI between the two countries has also witnessed a marginal increase. Latest figures I got, US FDI in India was at $28.3 billion, which was an increase of 4.4% from the previous year. But India, considering it's a much poorer country, also increased its FDI in the US 3.7% to $9.3 billion US dollars. So these numbers do suggest a healthy partnership, but very clearly a lot more can be done in this regard. But as I was saying, the areas of convergence can't mask the fact that the two countries don't necessarily see eye to eye on all issues. There's a perception amongst critics, not just in India, that these soft power, feel-good aspects we've spent some time on already don't entirely make up for a lack of substantive progress in the hard strategic, economic, political, and security issues that in many ways are more important. Take the issue of H-1B visas, which we've mentioned already, and the Congressman has mentioned also. Indians, since 2007, have been the largest group, Indian citizens, have been the largest group of H-1B applicants to the US. The number of Indian applications have increased steadily from 166,575 in 2007 to over 300,000 in 2016. But with the administration's attitude and President Trump's attitude towards ensuring fewer H-1B approvals in the interests of protecting American jobs as he sees it, obviously the number of Indians who want to work in the US has been significantly affected. And IT professionals who've been globally recognized for their skill and for the contributions they've made are amongst the principal victims of this. So I wish you luck, Congressman, with your, he's stepped away, with his resolution. Similarly, at the national security level, how understanding is the US of India's security concerns, especially vis-a-vis Pakistan? Here, President Obama, and to an extent President Trump, after some tough talk about Pakistan's sponsorship of terrorism, have indeed inspired some confidence that the US does pay serious attention to India's core national security interests. But the past hyphenation of India with Pakistan is an area of significant irritation, needs to be abandoned again, as it was under Bush 43. And the Afghanistan dependence. You know, the grizzled American general once said to me that only amateurs discuss tactics, semi-professionals discuss strategy, true professionals focus on logistics. And that's really what we seem to be witnessing, that the logistical dependence of the US on Pakistan to support, fuel, transport, and move the troops in Afghanistan have given Pakistan an overwhelming influence over American choices in the area. Then there's also the perception that there's a strategic attempt at mollifying India in this regard without developing a narrative of concrete substance. To take a simple example, just prior to Modi's and Trump's interaction in July, which we spoke about, the US had assigned the tag of global terrorist to a man called Saeed Salahuddin, the leader of the Hizbul Mujahideen. But this had no practical effect. As they like to say in New York, that and 65 cents will get you a cup of coffee. While it was a token of recognition of India's security concerns, it wasn't accompanied by any action against Pakistan, the state that provides Salahuddin and his terrorist colleagues safe haven and succor in the first place. So what's it worth? You know, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt him. Anyway, while there's been some appreciation from Trump for India's role in Afghanistan, there continues, it seems to us, to be greater receptivity to Pakistani objections than Delhi considers reasonable. And of course, we're also seriously concerned about the prospect of the US pulling out of Afghanistan and leaving the country to the mercies of the Pakistani ISI. It's been a relief that President Trump's latest statement at least defers that possibility for now. Cooperation between India and the US on counterterrorism clearly has improved after 26/11, which was our 9/11, the attack on Mumbai in 2008. But the two countries have not gone much beyond information sharing, though the access somewhat belatedly granted to the Pakistani-American terrorist enabler David Coleman Headley helped overcome some Indian misgivings about the depth of this cooperation. This is one area where real teeth could be added, not least to reassure Indians that the US's understandable desire to cut its losses in AFPAC would not leave our country more vulnerable to those who would like to gain from an American departure. India is also wary of the possibilities of a greater US-China relationship under Trump, and especially after the Mar-a-Lago summit with President Xi. As some analysts have observed, China's greatest bargaining chip with the US has been its capability of keeping a leash on North Korea, something President Trump has made it clear he would greatly value. Should President Xi be able to ensure that he can control the guy in Pyongyang, then certainly Trump would have every incentive, as he himself has said, to take America closer to China. At a time when ambitious Chinese expansion projects, such as the Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC, and the so-called Silk Route are being viewed with increasing concern by New Delhi, which views these developments through a prism of national security and sovereignty concerns, there is a concern that any warming of US-China relations would inevitably come at the expense of the US-India relationship. We certainly also would welcome the US showing more interest in resisting China's irredentist claims to Indian territory, particularly its habit of dubbing our state of Arunachal Pradesh as South Tibet, an issue on which the US has stayed conspicuously neutral. The question of the strategic intent of the relationship goes beyond the subcontinent. Obama's support in the Indian parliament for New Delhi's claims to a seat on the Reformed Security Council, something else that Congressman Krishnamurthy mentioned this morning, again, seem to be purely rhetorical flourish, because it's not been followed up by any instruction to American diplomats around the world to execute this commitment or even to pursue the objective. The suspicion remains that what Indians mistakenly saw as a big substantive triumph during President Obama's visit, in fact, was little more than lip service, a rhetorical flourish intended to massage Indians' ego without actually committing the US to any policy change. Now, of course, Indians must beware of seeing the US relationship in terms of a checklist of Indian expectations alone. A former US ambassador, Robert Blackwell, a friend of mine, once said, India wants the US to invest, India wants the US to keep its markets more open, India wants the US to give more visas for its professionals, India wants us to be helpful on Kashmir and dealing with Pakistan, India wants US support for membership of the UN Security Council, India wants this and India wants that. Tell me, what will India give us in return? And this is not elementary transactionalism alone, because Blackwell was very much an exponent of the support India for its own sake school of American foreign policy thinking. Rather, it reflected a genuine level of exasperation in American foreign policy circles that India should not ignore. The fact is that Washington has reason to feel that New Delhi has not done enough to define its own sense of its role as an emerging great power, and consequently, India has no settled vision of what it wants from a strategic partnership with the US, other than these checklist of items that I mentioned. India is gradually moving from its traditional obsession with preserving its own strategic autonomy in the face of external pressures to a broader acceptance of its own responsibilities in shaping the world in which it wants to thrive. But if you look at my policy prescriptions in my book, Pax Indica, India and the World of the 21st Century, published 5 years ago, India has still shown an amazing diffidence, reluctance to take the kinds of steps that I advocated to actually play a significant role. We have the capacity, the human resources, the technology, the capital to make a real difference in the stewardship of the global commons on everything from cybersecurity to cyberspace to outer space. But we don't actually do that. We don't seem to step up to the plate yet with enough confidence. So, the first BJP government 10 years ago and the then Republican administration both used the phrase natural allies for the first time. That phrase isn't being used anymore. People are more careful to just speak of partnership. But the fact is, what does that phrase mean and what could it mean in the years ahead? That needs to be fleshed out. And that brings me to my fourth and final point. The turbulence of the Trump administration and the current backlash against globalization may make the management of our areas of divergence difficult. But given the alignment of our strategic interests as I've described it this morning, that should not be impossible. Part of the success of the India-US relationship will lie in how effectively our two countries manage the differences that inevitably will rise between us, between any two democracies. Diplomats like to pretend that there are no difficulties or misunderstandings, but as I've pointed out, many have risen in the recent past that we like to brush under the carpet. And I think, mismatched priorities on issues like terrorism, threat perceptions in India versus what the US sees, incompatible views on Pakistan as a credible partner for peace, continued disagreements on aspects of trade relations, including our dueling positions on the Doha round that Senator and former Agriculture Secretary Mike Johans was talking to me about last night. I mean, these are all issues which, it seems to me, have divided us in the past. And let's face it, there are also issues of style. American insensitivity as we see it, Indian preachiness as Americans see it, have tended to rub each other the wrong way at different times. But on geopolitical fundamentals, and Professor Morrison said this at the very start, there is no real clash of interests. On no issue of vital national interest to either country, with the possible exception of Iran, is the other arraigned on the so-called wrong side. Now, the 21st century world is one in which an emphasis on the shared values of both countries, democracy and pluralism, tolerance and transparency, respect for personal liberty and human rights, has greater relevance than ever. For the first time in human history, a majority of the world's population lives in democracies. The idea that the two principal ones of special interests and responsibilities is not a fashionable one, but it could become one of the defining features of the new era if our two countries get it right. As democracies, India and the US have the additional responsibility of establishing and running international structures to cope with the myriad challenges of the 21st century that go beyond the capacity of any one state or alliance to resolve. These include terrorism and nuclear proliferation, but also less conventional threats, state failure, transnational organized crime, the spread of pandemics, piracy in international waters, the management of cyberspace and the military misuse of outer space, which I've mentioned, the threat of Islamist fanaticism, and the rise of an authoritarian China, which really pose specific national security challenges to the US and India. If we handle these well together and in cooperation, we could assure a safer world. The US has to come to terms with a world whose center of gravity has clearly moved away from the Atlantic to Asia, and to determine where it sees itself in relation to the incontestable rise of China and the growing prowess of India. If the relationship with India is going to become as important to America's security as Europe's once was, wouldn't America need to revise its own position on the threats and challenges India faces? And yet the fundamental driver for long-term relations between the US and India remains the importance of America, the nation, not just the government, as a partner in India's own remaking. As I've argued before, the basic task for us in India and international affairs is to wield a foreign policy that enables and facilitates the domestic transformation of India, pulls our people out of poverty, gives us, all Indians, the future our people deserve. The relationship with the United States is part of an effort to make possible this transformation of India's economy and society through our engagement with the world, while promoting our own national values of pluralism, democracy, social justice, secularism within our own society. The turbulence of the Trump era perhaps makes this a bit complicated. I do believe we can make it happen. The Indo-US partnership contributes towards a global environment that is supportive of these internal priorities, that facilitates our energy security, our food security, our environmental future. When we succeed in our national transformation, we'll be including more and more of our people in that great narrative of hope, which has also been the narrative of social and economic development in America over the last 200 years. We are going to, if we get it right back home, we're going to bring 500 million Indian villagers into the global village. That's 500 million more friends of the US, a market for the US, and an opportunity for the US. I hope you will seize it, and I hope we'll make it easy for you to do so. Thank you very much. I wish you a successful conference. Jai Hind.